everyone. My name is Damilola Ezekiel, and I am recording this talk from Lagos, Nigeria. I am a technical writer and a developer advocate. And one of my very interesting hobbies that I do is that I run and I cycle. So for today's talk, I will be talking about creating documentation that developers will actually read. And I think this is a problem in our ecosystem because we have like a lot of docs out there that developers do not want to read or do not like to read, or they've read before and they do not like. So the basis of my talk will be talking about how to create documentations that developers will like to read. And this year says developers don't hate docs, they just hate bad docs. And you may be wondering, how do I know this? I carried out a survey with 5 engineers, and here's what they have to say about documentation. The first person says documentation is a real source of truth, and blogs are often outdated and they miss changes in libraries or tools. And this is quite accurate because a lot of times many people write blogs and they forget to update the blogs. Meanwhile, documentations are usually updated to meet the current standard of the library or tool. The second person says documentation is usually more comprehensive. And I also believe that because I feel like docs are quite comprehensive. That's when you read a good docs. And I also trust the library owner or maintainer's work more than that of a random article. This next person says docs are my first stop because the answer I'm looking for is always right there. And the last person says, I avoid documentation because they are often poorly organized, overly complex, leave me confused than when I started. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this because there are times that I myself have read documentation and it left me confused before more than when I started. So why do developers skip docs? We've seen the reasons. We've seen that these devs that I carried a survey out for, they actually do read docs, but they only have sentiments. But so we are going to take a look at why some developers keep technical documentation. And the first reason is because documentation is usually an afterthought. For many projects or for many organizations, they prioritize writing code. They want to ship the code as fast as possible. They want the code to be up to standard, and then they neglect documentation. So this leads to them writing documentation after the whole product is complete. And this could lead to documentation being out of sync with the code base, thereby making it unreliable for developers that want to use it. The second reason is because of time pressures and deadlines. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this. There are many times that we are working and we have a deadline. Say you have to ship something in like the next 2 days. Obviously, documentation is not going to be your go-to because there's no time. Where do you want to start reading docs? So you're probably left to go and search Google, check Stack Overflow, and the likes. The next one is confidence bias. I know developers have so much confidence in themselves and they're like, how hard can it be? Obviously, I know JavaScript and this is the JavaScript library. I should be able to figure it out as I go on. Why this can work for maybe simpler tasks, I think it will be very much complicated when you're working on things that are very complex. Now, the search first mentality. And what is the search first mentality? This means when developers hit a roadblock or they hit a blocker, the first instinct, the first thing that occurs to them that they should do is to probably open Google and ask their questions. And even better, with ChatGPT and other LLMs out there, it's easier to just take a screenshot of your code and then put it there, and ChatGPT gives you the response. So this can make you feel like, oh, I don't need documentation when I have ChatGPT or when I have Stack Overflow or when I have Google. Now, this next point is a very critical point because I feel like a lot of documentation lack good architecture, and information that people need are scattered across different parts of the documentation, thereby making it hard to find information that people actually come to look for. Now that we've seen the problems, we've seen why developers do not like to read docs, we've seen why they skip documentation, we've seen those reasons. How do we as technical writers now create documentations that developers will actually want to use? So the first one, which is my favorite, is using the docs as code approach. And what is the docs as code approach? The docs as code approach is a method that allows you write documentation with the same tool that you use to write code. And what are these tools? We have our text or code editor. Maybe you use Sublime or you use VS Code. We have markup languages, could be ASCII doc or maybe the regular Markdown that we use, and then static site generators. So instead of using tools like WordPress or other CMSs, When you use static site generators, it allows you update your documentation frequently, and you can always push to GitHub when you are done. And what are SSGs, as I call them? We have Docusaurus, we have Doxify, we have Gitbook, we have Google. And then we have hosting platforms at Vessel, Netlify, and GitHub pages. And then you can also use CI/CD tools push to your GitHub repository using version control, also known as Git. Now, the second solution to this, which I think might be a bit controversial because not a lot of people want to adopt this method. I usually say it is very, very necessary for technical writers to be embedded in the development teams. And what do I mean? From this image I have on my screen, it shows where we have engineering team, and then they ship their code, work on the code, make sure it is perfect. And then when they ship the code, technical writers now come on board and they'll work on the documentation. But for our documentation to be accurate, for developers to be able to want to read our documentation, I do think that technical writers and developers should work together hand in hand, not just after when developers have shipped their code, but as they are writing the code, technical writers are in this team. They know every use cases. They know the decision making behind every of the things that are in the code. So this will enable them interpret what the developers have built into docs that people will actually read and understand. So embedded technical writers within dev teams create better context, accuracy, and then they can also update documentation in real time. The next point is structuring documentation for different needs. I'm sure many times, if there's anyone here that has ever needed an answer to probably a question that they have, and they go to the documentation and they are seeing a whole lot of information, it feels like information overload, and you don't know where to start from. So when you structure documentation for different needs, because everybody has different reasons why they come to use their documentation. So people just want to get started. So people want to maybe learn how to use this tool or framework from scratch, or some people just need references. And this is where we have direct access framework. So the direct access framework allows you to organize your content into 4 different types. We have the tutorial, and that's the people that actually want to learn. Probably you want to start learning a particular tool. So when you have the tutorial section, people that need to learn tutorial don't have to look so far before they get information that they need. We also have the how-to guides, and this is problem solving. So take, for instance, I have a documentation and I want to learn how to create an header and a navbar in Nest.js. Obviously, there should be a section there that teaches me how to do this, rather than having to read documentation from start to finish. We also have the references and the explanation. This diagram here shows the 4 different types of documentation that you can write using the direct access framework. The tutorials, which is learning oriented, how-to guides, task oriented, that just want to quickly do something, just want to quickly get answers. Then explanation explains the whole concepts. It gives you deep understanding of the tool. And then we have the references. That's where you get information. Now, this next one is scaling your documentation globally. I'm from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm an English speaker, and I'm sure I'm speaking to over 80% of Spanish audience. So this also implies that whenever you write documentation and documentation is in English, definitely not all of our audiences, all of our users are English speakers, which means the documentation might not work for them, and this may lead them to find other resources that may solve their problem. So when you scale your documentation globally by using localization tools, this helps you translate your documentation into different languages so it can be accessible to developers from everywhere. Next, I have this creating interactive documentation experiences. And I think this is one thing that a lot of documentation miss out on. There are so many words. The documentation is just filled with content, words here and there, but less action. Developers have to start copying code from the documentation, then go back to their text editor to see how it works. And I think that can be quite stressful. But if you use interactive documentation, if you use tools like, if you embed tools like Code Sandbox and Replit or Stackbase, it allows them to test the code right there in your documentation without having them leave to go and test it in their own working environment. An example of this image I have here is from Material UI. The Material UI documentation is built in such a way that for every of their components, you can actually test with Code Sandbox, as you can see in the image. You can test with Code Sandbox, you can make edits, you can rewrite it just to see your changes in real time. And what this will help developers do is that they don't have to go back to their code base or they don't have to go back to their environment, start making changes. They see the changes right there in the documentation. Now, the next point is referencing good documentation. I'm sure as much as we have bad documentation out there, there are also documentation that are very, 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 very good. And here are some from my own personal experience of reading documentation and writing documentation. Here are some that I always recommend people to go back and look at whenever they need examples of good documentation. And I have the refine.dev documentation. I have the Tanstack query. I have Next.js. And with Next.js documentation, even if you have no previous knowledge about writing Next.js. With the Next.js documentation, you'll be able to build a very simple app in no time just by reading documentation. And then Material UI, one of my favorite documentation ever, is very straightforward and intuitive. And you can test every use cases you want right there in the documentation without leaving. So you get answers that you want without having to go back to your environment to make the changes. I also have Tailwind CSS, and I think everybody's favorite has to be Stripe. So Stripe too has very awesome documentation that you can always reference when you need to know examples of documentation that you can use for your own writing. Now, the next one is writing clear and effective readmes. And I think this is particularly tailored towards open source projects. And I've seen cases where open source projects, when you want to make contributions, the README is not clear. You don't even know what the project is all about. Obviously, you're not going to be able to make contributions to a project that you have no idea what it is about. So what should a good README contain? It should explain what the project is and why that project exists. You should show how to install or get started. So if it's like a tool or a framework or a library, you should show contributors or users, how do I install this? How do I get started quickly in very short words without making it so bogus? You highlight common use cases or examples of what you might use a particular tool or framework for. And then you can also refer them back to contributors guidelines and community links. So if you're using our project and you have an issue, you can always send your answers or questions to our community. And one of the very fantastic resources for writing a very good README is this makereadme.com. If you check it out, you see steps and guidelines on how to curate a perfect README that will work for you and your project. And now that we've seen the solution, we can see that good documentation means better developer experience, because if developers are able to use your docs and they're able to get every use case that they want, it means they get good developer experience. And good developer experience means your product will be adopted by the developer community. And when your product has a high adoption rate, it means more for your business. So good documentation leads to better developer experience, which in turn leads to higher product adoption, and finally, very good for business value. And if you need more resources on how to structure your documentation in such a way that would make developers want to read or that would make them want to reference, you can check out the Direct Classes framework. You can check out makeareadme.com. You can check out Docs for Developers book by Jared Batty, and that's one of the very fantastic book on writing for developers. It details every use cases and everything that you need to do in order to be able to write content for developers. And if you need a community of writers and documentation engineers, you can join Write the Docs community. And finally, we have Tech Writers Hub. It's a blog for technical writers. If you need any reference, anything that relates to technical writing, you can always reference Tech Writers Hub. And finally, if you can follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and then my blog on Medium. Thank you very much. Gracias. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Thank you.